So what I wanted to do is give you sort of an overview of best practices for setting up an experiment. And for some folks, this actually might be very familiar, especially scientists in the room. For others, for cheesemakers, this session has been targeted towards, this may be a novel way of thinking. And the goal here is to make sure that if you're going to be doing an experiment, which you should all do if you can, to set it up in a way that you can get the most out of it. So you can interpret the results to actually make change in your cheese and hopefully change for the better. So what I'm going to do is just briefly overview the essential components of a good experiment. And keeping in mind that we're all coming at an experiment from very different perspectives. But the first thing is to come up with a good set of questions, hypotheses, and predictions. And you may say to yourself, if you're in the business of doing an experiment, if you're a scientist, shouldn't you be really good at asking questions? It's actually one of the things that my students struggle with the most, is asking a very good question. And when I say a good question, I mean something that's really clear, specific, and you can actually address and answer with an experiment. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit. We'll talk about variables. And again, many of you, if you've had any science training, this should all be very familiar, but we'll talk about specific applications to cheese. We'll also talk about experimental units and sampling units. When you do an experiment, how many wheels of cheese do you need? And how do you sample them to get the best information out of that experiment? And finally, we'll talk about the two important R's in experimental design, replication and randomization. And we'll talk about why you need to do those. Okay, so let's jump into this. So for questions, hypotheses, and predictions, as I said earlier, make your questions and hypotheses as specific as possible. So for example, if I ask the question, what can I do to make my washed-rind cheese taste better? It's not a really great question, right? Because taste better isn't a very specific goal or a specific question. It's a very broad, open-ended question. So try to really dig down into one or two variables that you're thinking about changing or controlling in your product, either in the make stage or in the aging stage. And then the other thing to do is to use all that amazing prior knowledge that you have, all that experience you've had seeing your cheese and working with your cheese, to pair the question with specific predictions. Like if I change the salt in this way, the flavor will change in this way. Or if I change the temperature of the aging facility, I predict that. Because those predictions will set you up to see if things actually worked in the way that you thought. And again, this all seems very intuitive, but you'd be surprised, even really good scientists, how often they make really bad experiments with bad questions and no predictions. So here's just a variety of different kinds of questions I thought of. Most of these are surface ripened cheese centric, because that's what I think about. And not all of these are great examples. There's sort of varying level of detail here. For example, you could ask the question, how do different strains of Geo impact bitter flavor intensity in a bloomy rind goat milk cheese, right? So you could imagine choosing 3 different strains of Geo and make your cheese with each of those 3 different strains and then measure bitterness. And maybe you've worked with one of those strains before, so you could predict what the bitterness would be like based on your previous experiment. And again, when you're really setting up your experiment, make sure you have a clear question, write it down, put it in front of you. A lot of my grad students, I make them actually put all of the questions they're asking for their thesis at their desk to continuously remind them why they're there and what they're doing. Because sometimes we can get really distracted when we're doing these experiments. So come up with a clear question and pair it with really great predictions. The second thing is thinking about variables. And I think one thing that can happen, and when I've worked with cheesemakers in the past before trying to set up experiments, I think because cheese is such a complex beast, we want to change many different things in one experiment, right? You want to try to test all kinds of different variables. And that becomes a really complex problem and actually ends up being a bad experiment because you can't really learn anything from it. So when you're thinking about variables, you should be thinking about what are your treatments, what are your controls, and what are your responses. Those are the 3 components of variables. So first of all, what are you actually going to manipulate that you hypothesize to actually cause some kind of response? So in that last question about the Geo strains, I'm manipulating the Geo strains. I expect that when I manipulate different strains of Geo onto my cheese, I'll get different amounts of bitterness. So that's the first thing to think about, those treatments. Controls are essential in any kind of experiment and are often overlooked. And a control treatment is where you don't really do anything. You keep things as you've had it in the past, or as they are sort of with an expected outcome. So if you make your cheese in a particular way, if you have a standard make, include that when you're also including your treatments. And again, if you're a scientist or if you've done any experimental work in the past, this seems very obvious. But for many who are coming into this for the first time, they'll often do an experiment where you do the treatment, where you change something. But if you don't have a control, you can't actually compare what you did to baseline. You can't see how what you're doing is actually changing it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And finally, your responses. What is it that you're actually going to measure? And as we heard earlier, there's a bunch of things you can measure in cheese, even though you know that cheeses taste different and will sell in different ways when you put them out into the market, that don't tell you anything. So you have to think really carefully about these responses. With that geo question, where the different strains of geo and bitterness, it's very obvious, right? You'd measure bitterness. You'd do a flavor or a sensory panel, and you talk about scoring bitterness. But for some other experiments, it might be more complicated. For some of these different slides, I've just chosen some of my favorite experimental cheese papers. This is one from France, where they're working with a camembert-style cheese. And this is actually, I would not recommend doing the number of treatments they did in this particular study. They were manipulating relative humidity with 3 different levels. They were measuring, manipulating temperature and a bunch of other factors. But what I wanted to show you is that you can actually learn something by just manipulating one of these things. So what we're looking here is ripening days. So this is the number of days this camembert has been ripened. This is the pH here on the y-axis, everywhere from 4.5 to 8.5. And what we're looking at, the 3 big treatments that they're trying to point out here, that these lines sort of separate right here, is the temperature that the cheese was aged at. And this is all before wrapping. So the wrapping day happens here about, I believe it's 12 days into the aging. And what they're showing you is, this isn't that surprising, but you gotta do the experiment to know, is that cooler temperatures and warmer temperatures have different rates of increasing the pH of the rind, which is not surprising, but again, you have to do the experiment. So again, here, the control was the 12 degrees, that's what they normally would do it at. The treatments were the different temperatures, and the response here is looking at the pH of the rind. And I'll just keep saying this over and over again, and Bronwen and I have talked about this a lot. Controls are really essential. You have to have that baseline to compare to. If you don't have that control, I know in some cheese-making operations, it's really small, right? And you can't really afford to make different treatments and have a control in the same experiment. Another sort of trick you can use is if you have really good baseline data from many batches of cheese from over and over again, you can use that general information as a control, right? If you're doing a manipulation, you can say, well, historically, this is what we get across 10 batches of cheese. When I start doing these treatments, how does it go away from that baseline? That is another strategy that you can use. Here's another example of a paper. This is looking at Stilton cheese and controlling the humidity environment. And they had different stores where they had a control versus a humid environment and looking at the percent moisture over time. And again, they had a control so they can see how their treatment changed over time. So controls are really essential. The other thing to think about is when you're doing any experiment, you need to collect data, right? And obviously, sometimes it's really clear what the data is you need to collect. Maybe you need to measure salt if you're changing how you salt your cheese. But sometimes you need to think about how much of the sample you need to collect, right? So how much of a wheel of cheese do you need to sample? Do you need to sample across multiple parts of the cheese to really capture the variability you might have within one wheel of cheese? And the other thing to think about, and this may not be obvious before you do the experiment, are what are the best time points to actually measure some kind of response, right? So you could arbitrarily select 10 days into ripening, but maybe the biggest, most dramatic responses happen at 21 days into ripening. So I always tell people, if you have the time and resources, collect as many data points as you can across the time of the ripening of the cheese. And again, I know there's various limitations, but it's the most ideal when you don't know exactly when the response you'll see is going to happen. So experimental units and then the sampling units. And keep in mind, you may need to take a really big sample for certain kinds of analyses or a small sample, and there is a lot of variation within wheels of cheese. So keep in mind that you may need to collect multiple wheels and pull them together. Another really important factor when you're thinking about setting up an experiment and collecting data is that there's a lot of variability, even within an environment that looks pretty homogenized. So this is up at the beautiful cellars at Jasper Hill. This is Bailey Haze and Blue aging on the racks there. And when we go up there and do sampling, or if Jasper Hill is doing experiments, we often think about variation even within a shelf, with one shelf of the cheese, right? So these are the edges of the shelf that are much closer to the center of the cave, and then as you go in, you're getting closer to the cave walls. And there are huge gradients in moisture, there's huge gradients in temperature, even in this very controlled facility there. So what you need to do if you're doing any kind of treatment, you need to make sure that as you apply that treatment, you place the treated wheels of cheese in different places in your facility. You randomize their location so that any of that variability that you have in your facility is captured by that randomization. And you may not be able to see that variability, right? Even if you're measuring all these things, you may not see it. So if you do some kind of treatment, make sure you stagger where those wheels of cheese are. And again, I know there are constraints in production environments, but at best you can, try to make that happen. And then another really important component of any good experiment is replication. And replication is this idea that if you just did an experiment with one wheel of cheese as a control and one wheel of cheese as a treatment, what happens to that one treated wheel may not represent all of the outcomes, right? Maybe something weird happened. Maybe it was too close to the edge of the cave, or somebody came by and did something when they weren't supposed to. So you need to have replicate wheels, multiple wheels of cheese, to know if your experimental outcomes are robust. And when we talk about replication, there's actually multiple kinds of replication. So here's an example of what we call technical replication. So this is one experiment I'm doing. I have two different treatments, an orange treatment and a green treatment here. And these are 3 wheels of cheese in each treatment. So this is a pretty decent experiment. I know that if I see something happening on all 3 wheels of these cheese in treatment 2 compared to treatment 1, which would be my control, I can make a good assumption that what's happening across all 3 wheels of cheese is reliable and robust. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially in a product like cheese that's seasonally variable, what you get in spring in your experiment may not happen in the fall. And so another thing we talk about in scientific experiments is experimental replication. So actually doing the same experiment that we did over here, but doing it 3 different times, where you're setting up the cheese, making the cheese, and applying the treatments 3 different times. So this way, if we see something in treatment 2 that's different from treatment 1 in spring, in summer, and in fall, we know that this is a very robust manipulation, right? And this is really hard. Again, it's a lot of resources to do this, but you'll be able to see across the seasonal variation of your cheese whether or not the manipulations really hold up. And I'll also point out that many scientists just do this. They don't do this. Many scientists don't replicate whole experiments. They just do technical replication, which in the field is very much frowned upon. So here's an example, I think, of a cool study that is looking at sort of integrating many of these components of good experimental design. And then I'll pass it off to Bronwen and to hear about the experiments that they've been doing. This is looking at camembert cheese. This is a study that's coming out of Brazil. And one of the main reasons I like this study that was in the International Journal of Food Microbiology is they have a great diagram of their experimental design, which most papers do not. Beautiful diagram here. So they have a really clear question in this paper. They were looking at how manipulating both the lactic acid bacteria, the type of penicillium that they use, as well as the way that they inoculated the penicillium, affected the sensory quality of camembert-style cheese. So it's a pretty clear, defined goal, and we have pretty clear treatments here. So here we have Penicillium candidum and camemberti, and then they were using 2 types of lactic acid bacterial sets from Chris Hansen's. One was the O type, and the other is the DL type. And then they have 2 ways of inoculating the mold. They're either adding it directly to the milk, or they're spraying it on after the cheese has been made. Now, one thing you'll note, if this was a perfectly set up experiment, this diagram would have an additional branch here to milk, an additional branch here to milk as well. This isn't a perfect experiment because, in terms of experimental design, because they had constraints here. So if they use the DL type bacteria and they added them to the milk, with the penicillium to the milk, it actually ended up forming eye spots in a camembert cheese, which is obviously not good. So there are constraints based on the types of cultures that they were using. That's why it's not what we call perfectly balanced. But these are a relatively reasonable number of treatments that they were able to apply here. And they had a great figure to clearly lay out the treatments they were doing. And they came up with really clear results. So they were, this is some of the data that came out of this study just to show you that you can get really clear results with a very simple experiment like this. When they were looking at their sensory panel, when they were looking at things like how sour the cheese was, they were looking at other things like softness and bitterness and a bunch of sort of broad categories. They were able to separate out the cheeses. This is an approach called ordination, where you can actually take a lot of different variables and partition out something like a very complex sensory data set. And they were able to find that the way that you inoculated, as well as the particular starter cultures that they were using, really drove the flavor formation in this particular cheese. So you can imagine manipulating the cheeses that you work with in a very similar way and coming out with some other really clear results like this. So again, this is a good example where they had a clear question, and if you read the paper, they have pretty clear predictions, a great clear experimental design. They had replication, and I don't actually know if they did this experiment multiple times across seasons, probably not, but I don't know these people well. I'm not critiquing their work here. If you're in the room, I'm sorry. But it's a really great example of just a clear experimental design that I think came out with some clear outcomes. So take-home messages, always have a control, always make sure that you have something you can compare your treatments to, keep things simple, think in advance of what your question is and make sure that that is really clear and pair it with predictions, and always think about the variability that you have in your cave and think about randomizing that. And at the end, we're not going to talk about it right now, but what I'd love to hear, because I always like to hear what cheesemakers are trying, what kinds of questions are you asking in your plants and in your aging facilities? How did you design your experiments? How did you set things up? And then I also really like, as a scientist, thinking about the challenges that you face when you're doing these kinds of experiments. And again, from working with Jasper Hill, I know that there are constraints. You just really want to make good cheese, and you may not have time to do all kinds of treatments and keep everything separate and keep things randomized. So I'd love to hear more about that, and I think there's going to be a larger conversation at the end of this panel about these particular topics. Great.
Good afternoon. I'm the cheesemaker at Bronwen and Vaar, the farm of Patrick and Becky Holden, where I make Havod, a traditional cloth-bound cheddar, which is based on early 20th century recipes. The farm is 330 acres, which includes rented land, and is situated mostly on a hill in mid-West Wales, just with a few miles away from the Cambrian Mountains. The farm has been organic since 1973. The herd is predominantly Ayrshire, currently with a milking herd of 72 cows. Virtually all the milk goes into cheese making, and we produce about 30 tonnes a year. So I started making Havod almost 3 years ago. Prior to that, I'd worked for 12 years for the Trethowan family, making Gorwith Caerphilly. The setup at Havod is that I'm paid a wage to make the cheese, but I'm in the unusual position that I've been given complete control over the cheese making by Patrick and Becky. So this is a great privilege to be given the freedom to be able to put my own ideas into practice and to test them. But it's also a great responsibility, and it's a responsibility I take very seriously. So when I took over in November 15, unfortunately there were considerable problems with the cheese. It seems that after several years of good cheese making, Havod had gone through a prolonged difficult patch. One of those things that besets cheesemakers, unfortunately, and I'm sure most cheesemakers here today have at one time or another had similar experiences. So there were numerous faults in the cheese, and this was the most prolific. It was these blue streaks surrounded by this soft white paste. Actually, what you're seeing is not the worst ones. The worst ones were there were sort of streaks almost the size of a rugby ball. So it was really quite difficult. So some whole cheeses were being spoiled. There were also wet patches on the rind, and if there were clean patches, there was often a histamine sensation. And indeed, we had this tested, and histamine was confirmed. So customers were complaining and returning the cheeses. Overall sales had dropped considerably. And because the orders were so low, the problem stock was just aging away in the storeroom. And this was only exacerbating the faults. Which meant, unfortunately, some entire batches had to be disposed of because they were just getting worse and worse. So some customers had ceased ordering altogether, and our biggest fear was that Neal's Yard Dairy was going to stop buying from us, but thankfully they stayed with us. Thank you, Neal's Yard Dairy. So for a small farm and a small business which was already carrying substantial debt, this was a grave position to be in. So it was imperative then to try and resolve these problems as soon as possible. So no pressure then for the new cheesemaker. So what seemed likely, now we're not scientists, so we didn't know what's going on, but what seemed most likely to all of us was that the faults were being caused by excess moisture in the cheese. So I should acknowledge that some steps had been taken prior to my start to attempt to get the cheese back on track. But from my observations of the make, I was still seeing that the drainage throughout the make was insufficient. The curds were still quite sticky at mill. When the cheese was coming out of the press, it was very soft. So that was where I decided to start. So my first step was to create a new standard make, focusing on good drainage of the curd. And so quite simply to start this, I intended to use a little bit more heat in the scald and to slow the make down to allow for improved drainage. So about this time, I'd heard that Bronwen's husband, Francis, had a suggestion for a system of experiments which involved repeatedly trying variations in the make. So this immediately appealed to me, as I had lots of questions of what would bring about an improvement in the cheese, or at least what would make cheese which was free of faults. Also, I was beginning to research old recipes from the early 20th century. So Havod for a few years had been based on the recipe in this book by Dora Saker, which was published in 1917. So I was reading that one. I was also reading this book, Professor Leach's 1932 book on cheddar making. And so what was beginning to strike me was just the sheer variety of methods in historical cheddar making. So a structured approach would allow me to test some of these old methods, and it would also allow me to put to test some ideas of my own. So on my second or third day, I phoned Bronwen, and we agreed on some things to test, and on my third make, I began the experiments. To begin with, these were very cautious, just some slight variations in temperature and timings. What were the problems and the weight of responsibility. I didn't want to make things any worse. So here's an example of the experimental makes. This is about 18 months into, also after I started. So I'm happy to say by this point, some of the cheese, my first cheese that I made were coming through with far fewer faults and an improvement in quality, which I can tell you was quite a relief. So this is all I do is preparation. I just piece of A4, write out the 4 makes and pin it near the door into the make room so I know what I'm doing, and then I simply annotate each make note with a brief description of what the make is. So the point of this, so there's always 4 makes. I usually repeat the cycle about 10 times, and the point of this is to see when the cheeses are eventually graded, if any patterns emerge. And any one-off unusual makes that, like Ben just described, can be identified as such, and then we can avoid jumping to any false conclusions. So make A is always the standard make. Make B, in this case, was a method I'd read in Professor Leach's book that I wanted to try out. Make C was a low dosage make, which we've for a long time been wondering whether a lower dosage might be the way to go. And make D was trying to bring about a drier and firmer cheese, as it was becoming quite clear that those types of cheese were particularly well graded. So then it's just a matter of waiting then till the cheeses are graded, and then we can see if any patterns emerge. In the meantime, I can then get on with another round of experiments, and Bronwen will now explain what happens next.
All right, so one of the best parts of my job at Neal's Yard Dairy is being able to go to many of the farms that we work with and select cheese on a regular basis. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to kind of, as Rob was saying, not just go and taste cheese and grade it, but really hear about what's going on at the farm and what problems people are experiencing and so forth. So with Holden Farm Dairy, we usually visit 3 times a year. And because we're only visiting every 4 months, we usually taste 4 months worth of cheese. So usually when it's between 6 and 10 months old, we'll taste every single batch that they make, and then we'll select the batches that we want for ourselves to sell based on how much demand we're expecting and the quality of the cheese. And so when Rob decided to embark upon this experimental round and method, we were really aware of the risks. I mean, we see a huge amount of variation between batches, as I was saying this morning, when people aren't changing anything about their makes whatsoever. And here we were about to go and make what we considered some pretty dramatic changes to these makes and make a fair amount of cheese using each of those make profiles as well. So we were well aware of the risks of this, and one of the things that I think we were, from all sides, particularly keen to do was to prevent any financial loss as much as possible from this process of developing new information. So one risk is that some of these changes might actually make the cheeses worse. And then the other big risk was the fact that cheddar takes a really long time to ripen. And by the time that we got that feedback, if we were tasting those cheeses from 6 to 10 months old, we could potentially have a store full of cheese that was not good to sell. So we wanted to mitigate those risks as much as possible. The first thing we wanted to focus on was rapid data collection and feedback. So as I said, we usually taste cheeses for selection, for commercial selection, when they're 6 to 10 months old. We needed to learn how to taste cheeses young. So we started tasting the cheeses down to the point when they were 2 to 3 months old, which was incredibly unusual territory for me. I know that lots of cheddar makers will grade their cheeses with official graders at that age, but for me tasting, and I think probably for Rob as well, this was something that we didn't. Young cheese tastes very different, and we wanted to be able to get some of this feedback data when the cheeses were as young as possible, partly so that we could develop our makes and develop the makes as quickly as possible, but also so that if there were things that were really problematic, we could identify those and nip it as quickly as possible. And so now, instead of tasting 4 months of cheese, we actually taste 8 months of cheese at those visits. We spread them over 2 days, and over that time, because Rob makes cheese every other day, we might taste up to 120 cheeses. We'll start on the first day by doing our commercial selection, by tasting through the cheese that's next up to sell and selecting the commercial batches that we think we like the taste of. And then on the second day, we'll go ahead and taste all the way down to the young cheese and start to then look at what patterns might be emerging. So when we select, or when I select, what I do is I have my selection book, and each line is corresponding to one batch and one batch date of cheese, and I will write the batch date and then a few random descriptors, and then a number from 1, which is essentially spit it out, disgusting, to a 5, which I've never given before, but which means retire now because you'll never taste a cheese this good again. And the interesting thing was that when we were then tasting these young cheeses, we wanted to then start to correlate what the results of this experiment were with our scores and with our tasting notes. And so what we would do is we would take our notes in the make room, we would take our notes in the cheese store, and we would go down, and we wouldn't know which batch was an A or a B or a C or a D make. It's completely blind, and we just go through, taste the cheeses, and try to keep our pace up as we go. And one thing that I would say, which was particularly interesting, particularly as we started tasting these first experimental cheeses, is I kind of half expected that we might not know which was which, but we would certainly see a sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern of make profiles where we'd be like, of course that's a D after you've tasted a few, that some patterns would start to jump out at us. Because after all, these are completely different variations of the make. And what I would say is, in general, we didn't see that. And that was really, really interesting, that against all of the other variations that were taking place unmeasured within these makes day to day, that those conscious changes that Rob was making were not necessarily jumping out at us to the extent where we could be like, yes, these 4 things are really different, to the point that we could just see them emerge out of the make notes. Now, one thing I want to say as well is that when we select for Neal's Yard Dairy, we're doing a selection based on our experience of tasting lots of cheeses and based on our experience of what we like. But I think in many ways I'm coming to understand better that is very different than the sort of quantitative sensory analysis that's maybe useful for getting the kind of feedback that's useful for developing a cheese. And I know very clearly that even though I've tasted thousands of batches of cheeses, I don't necessarily know how consistent a taster I am. I don't know how my sense of taste compares to my colleagues. These are all things that I think we as a company need to explore a lot more, because I don't think that we really understand them. And so from the perspective of this experiment, certainly half of the experiment was what Rob was doing in the vat, changing the make every day and really trying to explore some of these concepts or some of these theories. If I do this, I think it's going to make it a little bit firmer, a little bit drier. If I do this other thing, it's going to have a different effect. But in order to gauge whether those differences were actually making an effect on the finished cheese, and what that effect was, we really need to have ways of tasting cheese that we can be confident are consistent and are statistically significant. And so this was one of the biggest learning places, I think, for me within this whole process, is starting to try to take these admittedly extremely random, off-the-cuff tasting notes, which I just scribble in the notepad. Really, when we're tasting cheeses to select, it all comes down to that score on the right-hand side, sort of how much we like it. Very seldom, only if there's a tie, do we kind of go back to the notes to try to determine, oh, what was that one like? Was it a little bit more this way or that way? So what I wanted to see was whether these random notes, when we looked at them a little bit more carefully, would actually show any differences between these 4 makes that would maybe help us understand what the impact of keeping the curds for 45 minutes under the whey before taking the whey off was, which is what the leach method was telling people to do. Pretty extraordinarily hardcore, actually, as an experiment to do, as any cheddar maker will tell you. Or using half the amount of starter, or scalding a half a degree higher and cutting softer and cutting finer. Could we taste those differences, and could those differences be shown to be statistically significant from the tasting notes that we were doing? So here is where the duplicates and the replicates that Ben was talking about, the experimental replicates, really come in. So what I did when we came out of the make room, the first step was that we then revealed, and you probably can't see very clearly in the margin here, we went down, Rob got out his make book, and we wrote down which of the batches each of those batches was. So now we could see what's A, B, C, or D. And then we went away and just transcribed that information into a different format. So we took all of the A's, all of the B's, all of the C's, and all of the D's, we lined them up in a single category. We tabulated their scores, but I also wrote down the make notes next to them as well. And so basically, again, just to refresh your memory from what was written on that sheet, make A was the standard make at the time, 1% starter, 39.5 degree scald, and basically what Rob was doing sort of every day as his best make. Make B was the leach method from 1932, where at the end of the stirring and scalding process, instead of basically allowing the curds to settle to the bottom of the vat for a few minutes, they were left at the bottom of the vat with all the whey on for between 40 and 60 minutes before the whey was taken off. Make C was half the amount of starter, but everything else kept exactly the same as the standard make. And make D was a softer set with a finer cut and a higher scald. So anyone who spent a lot of time with Yvonne will know that these are all things that you would do classically to try to get more moisture out of those curds. And so when we compiled the information like this and started looking at it statistically, a couple of things jumped out at us. The first thing was that if you look at the average of the scores, in many cases, they're not really that different from one another. So we've got 4.17, 4.15, 4.13, and we've got this one a little bit higher at 4.36. Now, part of this, I would say, is the fact that my scoring system is terrible. And that all of my scores are bunched into this tiny little range where 3.5 is really bad and 4.5 is like really good. And in terms of finding statistical significance from data that's scrunched up like that, it's really, really not a very good scoring system. And I think in terms of designing better experiments, or in terms of grading young cheese in a way that really bring out these differences going forward from a score point of view, I need to reassess what that scoring system looks like to actually accentuate the differences. This isn't about quality for eating at this stage. This is about trying to accentuate the differences between the scores. The other thing is that this is borne out by the standard deviation, which is just a measure of how broad the distribution of all these different scores were. So you can see that in general, we've got sort of plus or minus 0.3 here, plus or minus 0.3, plus or minus 0.5, so these were really variable down here, plus or minus 0.12, so much less variable in the hotter scald, softer set make. But if you took these and graphed them and you looked at where those error bars overlapped, none of these are statistically significantly different in terms of the scores. They all overlap. The make D is the biggest outlier, but we really can't tell any difference in the scores from these three whatsoever. So that's fine, that's what we can get out of the numbers. And then I wanted to see, all right, are these random words that I'm writing down, do they make any sense? Are there any trends in the words that I made on all these make notes, not knowing what was what? So my colleague Eric Meredith is really big into word clouds, and he'd done some surveys at Neal's Yard Dairy looking at, asking people's opinions on things, and to report some of the answers that he'd gotten, he fed them into an internet program that will give you what's called a word cloud. And a word cloud is basically a way of showing the frequency with which certain words appear in a set of text. So the more a specific word appears, the bigger and bolder it looks in the word cloud. So we made I basically copied and pasted all those words and pasted them into a word cloud generator. So the first 1% make, the standard make, you could see that the word that really popped out as occurring over and over again in those make notes was acidic. It was acid, fairly curdy, and then these tiny little words around the side, it might have been ones that appeared once in all of the set of words. So you had some burnt, lumpy, juicy, sappy, rich, whatever. So that was the standard make. Then if we compare that with the leach make, it was really interesting because acid is there, but it's there, like, I think it showed up once. And actually, we have these other words like fresh, which, again, what do these words mean? We need to, what I can say is, I said fresh a lot more on B batches than I said it for A batches, but we also need to define our terms really carefully because what I mean is fresh might not be what anybody else means is fresh. And so for me, fresh is a sort of more integrated acidity. It's a more juicy, gentle acidity. If a cheese is acid, it's really lemony and strident, whereas for me, a fresh cheese is something that still has a fair amount of acidity present, but it's a much mellower, more gentle acidity. So that was really interesting because thinking back to this make, basically we just left those acidifying curds to sit under the whey until the TA was 24, 25?
Sorry,
The TA, when you took the whey off of the leach?
the leach guidance was 2.3 to 2.5. We were getting it 2.1 to 2.3.
So basically, our normal pitch is 0.16. And so this is significantly more acid. If you think about what we expected to happen with this, we expected super acid cheeses. And instead, they had more integrated acidity. It's really fascinating. It did not go with our hypothesis. So then looking at the C, which was the 0.5% starter, that was also really, really interesting because, as Rob said, this is one of the things that he'd been thinking for a long time. Maybe less starter, slower makes are the key to a better cheese. And what we really saw is all the words were really small. It was a completely variable set of tasting notes. There weren't single words that were jumping out more and more. my impression, and also the really high standard deviation in those scores, makes me think that using less starter actually results in more variable cheeses. So there are other unmeasured variables going on in the background of that are affecting the results far more than the use of less starter. So that was a really interesting thing, because again, I kind of had my money on less starter. Everyone likes using less starter. Starter's not cool these days. And then the final one was the treatment, where we essentially looked at what would be designed from first principles to make a drier curd. So we had softer set, finer cut, and then just a half a degree more scald. This wasn't a really high scalded cheese, 40 degrees rather than 39.5. And there, we saw a completely different set of words come out. So here, the really predominant word was golden. And again, golden, what is she talking about? But from my perspective, the way I use golden is for a cheese that it has a darker yellow color, much less acidity, a much rounder, warmer flavor. I really particularly like the profile of sort of the golden profile of Havid. The other thing that really jumped out was the powderiness. And I think people who are familiar with Havid recognize that sort of micro-powdery texture that sometimes you get within the curd. It's not terrible, it's not like rough, but there is a powderiness that I don't think we necessarily see in other cheddars. And it was really interesting to me that this pattern of the powderiness co-segregated with the slightly higher scald cheese and the softer set as well. And again, is any of this significant? I have absolutely no idea. But what I am really interested to see is that when we started looking at these notes in a more statistical way rather than just as a one-off, and when we had up to 10 different batches to add together to start looking at them, to draw those conclusions from, we started to see patterns that then allowed us to go on to make our next set of experiments. And again, I showed Rob this information and said, over to you, buddy. So back to you, Rob.
So as it seemed that, even all those things were said, it seemed that MakeD was liked the best. So my next round of experiments was a follow-on one from that. So all these makes were to bring about the drier and firmer sorts of Havod. So two of them with a 40-minute set rather than the more standard 50-ish minute set, again to try and bring out more moisture. So you might be wondering why I didn't, as 40 degrees seemed better, I didn't do all four of them at 40 degrees. There's two reasons. One was in the previous round of experiments, we had to pasteurize because the farm had lost its TB-free status. By this round of experiments, we were back to raw production. So while it seemed quite clear that 40 degrees suited the pasteurized makes, what I was seeing in the raw makes was that 40 degrees might possibly have been getting the curds a bit too dry. So I just want to hedge my bets. If in the long run it can be proved that the 40 degree scald does work in the main for the raw milk makes, then I'll change it all. So time will tell. And experiments with cheddar requires an awful lot of patience because you've just got to wait so long before you get any feedback. So then some general, should I have gone on anywhere yet? So some general points about these makes. I think it's a great way of acquiring knowledge and becoming familiar with the various way the curd behaves in your make under different conditions. And it's knowledge that can be acquired in quite a short time. So I've learned an immense amount in the last almost 3 years about the practicalities of cheddar making, well, historic cheddar making, since embarking on this project. For these reasons, I'd particularly recommend this method for new cheesemakers, also for experienced cheesemakers who are starting on a new recipe. And even if you're an experienced cheesemaker who just makes the one cheese or the same cheeses, it's a great way of re-engaging and becoming interested in your make again. I know as any cheesemaker that the work is repetitive and it can become a tedious experience. Personally, I've found a renewed enthusiasm since becoming the Havod cheesemaker and getting involved with these experiments. Another point is it doesn't cost anything. This is free. Some small producers and new producers might not be able to employ consultants for advice, with apologies to consultants here today. This way just requires paying attention to your make over time, maybe a bit of research if you're so inclined, making a simple plan, testing your ideas, and then eventually evaluating your grading notes. So whether it's the latest scientific theories, historical methods, or your own ideas based on your observations, they can all be tested to see if they work or not for your make. And most of us cheesemakers aren't scientists. I mean, I only have the most basic knowledge of cheese making, microbiology, and biochemistry, and even that's an exaggeration. But we can apply, possibly not in the most rigorous way, a little bit of scientific method to educate ourselves to become better cheesemakers and to improve our cheese. But can this approach really improve the quality of the cheese? I think it can, and perhaps the best way I can illustrate this is if we have a look at our sales to Neal's Yard Dairy. The cheeses on the left-hand side were cheeses made in the months before I started. This was the problem period. This was this period where all those faults were coming through. And the cheese on the right-hand side were cheeses made by me about a year after I started, after doing several rounds of experiments. So the figures are slightly exaggerated because they were at an all-time low on the left-hand side. But nevertheless, I think it's quite clear that a change came around, and a change came around fairly quickly, and sales have remained quite good ever since. And because the faults have cleared up, wastage has been substantially reduced. And if I can just digress briefly, there's a couple of points on that I'd like to make. So one of the measures that was put in place before I started as a response to the problem cheese was hot dipping, or hot bathing. So if you're unfamiliar with this, this procedure is the submersion of the cheese into very hot water for a short period just after they're taken out of the press in order to produce a rind. But my experience of it was that I never saw the formation of a rind. So if a cheese had cracks in it when it came out of the press, I saw that it still had cracks in it when it came out of the press. It was just wet now. So interestingly on this point, so in my small collection of historic cheddar and cheese making books, hot dipping is sometimes mentioned and sometimes not. So Professor Leach, Professor of Dairying in the West of Scotland College of Agriculture, mentioned in 1932 that Scots cheddars were hot bathed and that English cheddars were not. He also writes, I quote, "The effect of bathing the cheese is to impart a firm rind and thereby to lessen the amount of subsequent evaporation." Well, when I started, we had a storeroom full of wet cheese, and if Professor Leach was correct, then the last thing I wanted to do was to prevent evaporation. So I haven't hot dipped for 2.5 years, and there's been no detrimental effect. The condition of the cheeses I've made since I've stopped hot dipping is the same as the condition of the cheese I made before when I was hot dipping, which is generally clean and just with occasional and minimal bluing. Another thing that had been put in place before I started was to use 2 layers of caps and binders instead of 1 when clothing and larding. So I continued this for some time because I didn't want to change too many things at once. And when they were mature and cut into, there was no difference between... for most of last year, I did 1 cheese per batch with a single layer. So once they were mature and cut into, there was no difference between the one that had a single layer of caps and binders and the ones that had 2 layers. So now I only use 1 layer on all the cheeses with a 50% saving in cloth. And by the way, that's what the cheeses mostly look like these days. So to conclude on the experimental makes, I intend to continue with them. There's still lots of things I'd like to try out. And I don't envisage a time when I won't be experimenting, because I think it's a really good way of acquiring knowledge and trying to improve the cheese. So I'm quite happy with the cheese we're making, but I still want to increase the rate of the better cheeses. And I think making ongoing refinements through this structured experimental approach is, I think, the best way to achieve this. And that's it. Thank you.